I have been studying Asian philosophy, specifically the Japanese tradition of Zen. You've heard of that. Have you ever heard of Zen poker? It's very similar to two-handed solitaire, but quite different. We'll try something. Some paper and a pen, and I will ask you to help me. All right? I will draw a picture onto the paper. Do you know what that is? No, this is a Zen playing card. Because at this moment, it is every playing card and no playing card. Very Zen. I will give this to you along with the pen. I'll turn my head away. Don't begin until I turn away. But when I turn away, I want you to draw a playing card into the rectangle. Now please draw the full card. Don't draw just the name. Don't just put the number. But really make it a correct picture of a playing card. Okay?
I'll try.
I'll look over here. You know, recently I was thinking about the classic Zen koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And I learned the answer. And if you like, later I'll explain that again. You're done. Turn the drawing face down. So now I cannot see what you have done. Now we play Zen poker. And for that, we will make use of a deck of normal cards. And also we need some gambling chips to make bets. So for that purpose, I think some matches will be fine, okay? So let's divide the chips about in half. So about half, and half for me. Except, you know, I play this game very, very well. Okay. I'll give you some extras.
Oh, thanks.
Now, as with the normal game of poker, we shuffle the cards and we will use a 5-card hand. But let's make it really fair. Can you tell me when to stop?
No.
There, okay, that's just above the middle. So we'll take the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards, just like in normal poker, and I won't even look. Here is the bet. I will bet 1 match. So please put 1 match also. I bet that in this group, there is a card that has the same value as your card.
Okay.
Did I win?
Yes.
I told you I'm very good at this game. But wait. Let's make another bet. Put in 2 chips. Good. We'll use the same hand. I will bet that there is a card of the same suit as your card. Did I win?
No.
Okay, I don't like this hand anymore. We'll use 5 more. Put in 3 chips. I will bet that there's a card of the same value as your card in this group.
No.
At the start of this game, I was quite happy. Okay? Oh, I'm making the wrong bet on this card. Okay, put in 4 chips. So, I will bet that in this hand there is a card of the same suit as yours.
Yes, there is.
Okay, see, now I'm getting better. I tell you what. Let's get to the end of the game.
All in.
All in, exactly right. You are thinking of a card. I have to try and be accurate about this. Let me see if I can do it. I'm not sure. Well, we're all in. I have no choice but to to say, okay, let's find out what was your picture. Oh, that's the ace of clubs. And that's why I win. This is one of only two routines on these discs that has been published before. It's also one of the more recent ones. The roots of this effect are based in what today we call the magic age cards, a binary sorting routine involving cards that have numbers on them, and the person thinks of their age or any number and tells you which cards have that number and which cards don't. And then you're able to figure out what their actual age is. That idea has its roots in China, going back 1,000 years or more. In the 1300s, it became popular in a very lovely version in Japan. In the West, one of the earliest references was a manuscript published as The Impenetrable Secret in 1749 by Benjamin Franklin and David Hall. It is almost certainly the first commercial trick ever produced in the United States. Now, in the early 20th century, new approaches came about, and the first one that's important was Charles T. Jordan's demon divination. Demon's divination involved 28 cards in a stack. It was a very clever trick, and in turn that begat Joseph Ovet's The Buddha Whispers, which reduced the stack to 24 cards. And that came out in 1933. In 1935, U.F. Grant produced a trick called Monte Carlo, the same basic idea, but with a gambling presentation which helped to conceal the mathematics. That also used 24 cards. Years after that came versions by Howard Albright and then Carl Fulvis and others. This version is something that I came up with in my 1984 book, Thequel. Now, several things are involved, but the first has to do with that stack. As I just mentioned, in the Jordan version, it took 28 cards, and in the subsequent versions, it was down to 24. I managed to reduce it to 8. That makes it a pretty easy trick to set up. In fact, it can be done with a borrowed deck of cards, and the other materials are things that can be found in a restaurant or at someone's home. So it can be done under almost impromptu circumstances. Let's talk about what you need. You'll need something to write on, a pen. Now, my preference is for a pen that writes with a bit of a thick line. You'll want something to be like poker chips. These can be matches, either a box of matches or a book of matches. You can use other things. You can use candies, for example, or if you have a lot of coins, you can use those. And then there's a deck of cards, and the cards are set up. The top 10 cards are set up. Now, I said that this stack was only 8 cards, and that's true, but there are 2 bluff cards, or null cards, to add to it. So let's explain what the stack is, and then we'll talk about how to use it. The first 5 cards are all hearts and spades. And the values are ace, 3, 6, and 8, plus a court card. Now, it doesn't matter if the ace, for example, is a heart or a spade. It doesn't matter which card is which. It just matters that there is a mix of spades and hearts, and they are these 5 values in any order. After that is another set of 5, and in this set, all of the cards are either hearts or clubs. And the values are 2, 3, 7, and 8, plus a court card. And again, the specific distribution as to which value is with which suit, we don't care. That's the setup. And that's simple enough that you can actually do it with a borrowed deck. It doesn't take a long time to get to this situation, especially because the order of the cards within their 5-card groups is not important. The deck is ready, and I usually start with it not in view. And I begin by talking about Zen, and there are some jokes in the patter that I find very funny. I draw a rectangle, And as you can see, I've drawn it fairly small. And the reason is I'm going to ask the spectator to draw a playing card. And in so doing, I am limiting their opportunities. Because in this size space, especially with a slightly thick pen, nobody can draw a 10. Not if they draw the full face of the card. They can certainly write the number 10 and the suit, but I ask them, please draw it. And in this way, the spectator's choice is restricted, even though it doesn't seem like it is. They are going to draw a card almost certainly that is 8 or less. Now, we will talk later about what to do if they draw some higher value. But in fact, the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, they're going to draw a value of 8 or less, and in fact, they are most likely to draw an ace, a 2, or a 3. So they draw whatever it is that they've drawn, and they put the pad away so that I can't see it. Everything is fair. And now I bring out the deck, and I bring out the poker chips, in this case, matches. The poker chips are not necessary for the trick. In some versions of this type of trick, based on the UF Grant model, the poker chips were actually used to record information. So by where you put chips on the table, it helped to keep track of the calculations being made during the performance. In this trick, all the calculations are very simple, and you will do them in your head. So the chips are not for that purpose. The chips are to create a better storyline and to create some good moments. So I divide them pretty neatly in half, so I give half of them to the spectator. And then I say, oh, I'll give you a couple more because I play this game very, very well. And so this attitude of, I'm going to play this game and I'm going to win, brings a story to the event. It's about something now. And that, I think, makes this into a much more interesting routine. So the deck is removed from its case. And I can shuffle the deck as long as I leave those top 10 in place. So I can do an overhand shuffle or a riffle shuffle, anything that will keep the top 10 where they need to be. And then I either cut or shuffle that stack, that setup, to the middle. But I keep a break with my little finger of my left hand. And of course, from the front, you don't see the break. And here I'm going to do a riffle force. Now, the riffle force goes back a very long time. Originally, when you see it in early literature, it was done using a long card. That's to say, a card that was a little longer than the rest of the deck. And that allowed you to riffle the front of the deck and stop on the long card as the spectator said stop. It was a very practical method. The first to come up with the idea of not using a gimmick card, but using a break, was probably Anneman, or at least the first to put it into print. He had it in the Jinx Winter Extra in 1938. And in Anneman's case, he riffled his thumb down the edge of the deck, or he riffled up from the front. But when he got to the point where he was going to switch, because in the standard riffle force, you've been stopped here, but you pull up at your break. What Anneman did was he did that cheat as he moved to here. So in turning, he was able to disguise that change. Jean Hugard had a similar idea in More Card Manipulations in 1941. A major version of this was published in The Sphinx in April 1949 by John C. Holt, and he had what he called the rocking chair force. And that is how it was taught to me. I no longer remember by whom, but when I was rather young. And it's a very nice idea. The choice can be done riffling from the front like this, which is how Holt did it. I prefer to riffle down the outer corner. But when the person says stop, I'm not on the exact same location here as where the break is. And what happens is the right hand takes the top half of the deck from where the break is and rocks forward. That's why it's called the rocking chair force. And that forward action disguises the fact that I'm losing the actual place they stopped me, and instead cutting to where I already wanted to cut. I always make a comment, so I say, please say stop. They do, and I say, oh, just above the center. So I make a comment as if I'm turning it to the side just to estimate approximately where they stopped me, because they could have stopped me anywhere. But of course, where they have stopped me is at my setup of 10 cards. So we'll use 5 cards to make a poker hand. And this, of course, is the first 5-card setup that we began with. And I say, I'll bet one chip. So I make them put in a chip. I'll bet one chip, not that your card is in this group, because that would be a stupid bet. There are too many possibilities. But that there's a card of the same value as yours in this group. And I don't look at the faces, because I already know what they are. And I show the faces to the spectator, and I say, am I right? Now, there's only two possibilities. If the spectator says, yes, Max, you're right, I very proudly take the chips with an attitude of course, I always win this game. If I'm wrong, I pretend to be a little upset with the spectator. I let her take the chips, or him, and I say, oh, I bet on the wrong thing about this hand. I should have bet on the suit. Put in two chips. And we both put in two chips. And I say, I bet that there is a card of the same suit as yours in this hand. And again, there's two possibilities. The spectator says yes or no. If the spectator says yes, and I was right the first time, now I'm great. Now I'm always right at this game, and I'm very proud. If I was wrong the first time, but I'm right this time, I react as if to say, yes, of course, see, I told you that was the right bet to make, and I win. If I'm wrong, either for the first time or if I'm wrong for the second time, I just pretend to be really annoyed. And that gives it a story. Either way, the chips go wherever they go, and I say, now we'll go to a new hand. If I've been winning, then the attitude is, we can even do it with another hand. If I've been losing, I say, the problem is with this hand. We'll do a different hand. Either way, I deal the next 5 cards because that's our second set. And I make the same 2 bets. I bet that there is a card of the same value as your card. And we put in 3 chips. And the spectator does the same. And either I win or lose. And I need to react accordingly. If I've been winning and now I lose, it's like I'm suddenly shocked and disappointed. If I've been losing and I lose again, now I'm very upset. If I've been losing but now I win, oh yes, I was correct to change hands. Playing the moment to be appropriate to the story that's being told about this game. However it works out, the final bet is for 4 chips and 4 from the spectator, and it has to do with the suit being among these 5 cards. And I react the same way. Whether I'm winning or losing, I'm giving the appropriate reaction. At this moment, something very nice has taken place. I now have enough information to finish the routine. I don't know precisely which card they've chosen, but I have narrowed it down to 2 cards. Let me explain. The first hand has a value of 1. Easy to remember because it's the first hand. So if the spectator says, yes, there is a card of the value that I'm thinking of, I mentally remember 1. If the spectator says, no, there is not a card of that value, I mentally remember 0. And now we do for the suit. If the spectator says, yes, the suit is represented, I now know it's either a spade or a heart. If the spectator says no, I know that it's a club or a diamond. So I am most of the way there. With the second hand being the second hand is a value of 2. Very easy to remember. If the spectator says, yes, there is a card of that value, I mentally add 2 to the previous total. So if the total was 1, it now has become 3. If the total was 0, it now has become 2. If the spectator says no on both, the value is 0. So there are only 3 possible outcomes. I now say about the suit, that the suit is there. And from this information, from that second hand, I now know the suit for sure. Because if the answer was no for the first hand and yes for the second hand, the card is a club. Do you understand why? If the answer was yes for the first hand and no for the second hand, the card is a spade. If it's yes for both hands, the card is a heart. If it's no for both hands, the card is a diamond. This is not a system. You could make it a mathematical system, but it's not necessary. It's so simple and so logical, you can just make the calculations and the assessment during the trick. So you really don't have to remember much of anything. You just have to remember whether they were yeses and nos. You now know for sure the suit of the card. But you also know something about the value of their card. Because assuming that the value of the card is 8 or below, you have a total. And the total is either 0, 1, 2, or 3. Yeah? So if the total is 1, that means an ace. If the total is 2, it means a deuce. And for a 3, it means a 3. A 0 will mean a 4, just because it's not covered by any numbers. You can't get the result of 4. So now you know it's one of those 4 choices, or maybe it's not. Because if you add 5 to each of those choices, you get to the 4 other values going up to 8. An ace plus 5 equals 6. So if you get a total of 1, it's either an ace or a 6. If it's a total of 2, then it's either a 2 or a 7. If it's a total of 3, it's either a 3 or an 8. And the only ones missing from that are the 4 and the 5. So if it's 0, it's either a 4 or a 5. So now I know something where I'm almost finished. And so I push all of the chips into the center. I'm all in, as they say. And I'm going to look through the deck, and I'm going to position 2 cards. Now let's assume that the spectator has thought of the ace of clubs. I'm going to find that ace of clubs, and I'm going to cut it to the top. The smaller of the 2 values is going to go to the top, because that is the more likely one for the spectator to have drawn. They're usually going to go for the lower and simpler value to draw. So I put the ace of clubs on the top. But I now look for the companion card to that, which is 1 plus 5, so that's the 6 of clubs. And I find it, and I move it to the face of the deck. But I'm trying to do this in a way that it's not totally clear what I'm doing, because I don't want to clear that I'm positioning a card on top or on bottom. It just should look like I'm arranging something with the deck, and I set the deck down and I say, for the first time, what card did you think of? And the spectator looks and says, in this case, the ace of clubs, in which case, I've done something pretty amazing. Now, if the spectator says that they thought of the 6 of clubs, that's still pretty amazing. And that's true for all of the pairs. So I'm always going to have a result of either the top card or the bottom card being the card that they thought of. Now the question is, what do you do if the spectator does draw a value bigger than 8? My personal approach is I don't worry about it. I have been performing this for over 30 years, and in all of those performances, the person has drawn a value larger than 8 only twice, and I'm willing to work with those odds. It's not like it's being recorded or something. So if it goes wrong, that's life. However, you might not feel comfortable with that. In that case, there are solutions, and probably the simplest one is to have in your pocket an ultra-mental deck. This is the deck that was invented by Joe Berg back in the 1930s that most magicians today call the invisible deck. And with that deck, you can show any card reversed in the deck. So if you've got one of those in your pocket, then in the very rare occasion that the spectator has drawn a court card, for example. So if it's the king of spades, you would take out and say, well, that's why I keep this deck with one card already turned over, and it's your king of spades. So you can get to a successful conclusion by carrying that extra deck. I don't bother. So, I want to play a game of psychology involving a deck of cards and you. Do you play cards? Sometimes. That's a good answer. I will begin by having the deck shuffled, but we'll let the lady do it. Can you mix them? Any way you like. From now until the end, I will not look at the face of any card, but you will see some cards. Very well done. All right. I will show you the cards slowly, one by one, and I want you to decide on one card that you see but don't tell me which one. All right? So we show them slowly. Do you have one? Oh, good. All right. So even if I had been standing behind you, looking over your shoulder, I would not know which card you are now thinking of, correct? Yeah, I think that's very fair. I will mix the cards, and I will show them to you again. And this time, when you see that card, the one you're thinking of, I want you to think stop. Don't say it, but think stop. And I will try to feel when you are thinking stop, and I will try to stop on that card. It's pretty good? I hope so. Did you think stop? Mm-hmm. You did, yes. I hesitated at that point, but I wasn't completely sure. Let me try. Do you know exactly which one it is? The number from the top? Okay. The position, do you know?
I don't know. I didn't count.
Ah, okay. So you don't know the precise position.
I don't know the...
Okay.
You want me to count?
No, I'm going to try and find it myself because it's my show. You hold the deck, and I will take the cards from you, and I will try to stop in the right place. I hate this part. Okay, done. I stop here. So now, for the first time, would you announce out loud the card that you were thinking of?
It was three of spades.
The three of spades.
Yes.
Turn it over. This is my version of a classic effect by Di Vernon, known as out of sight, out of mind. It was first explained in print in Vernon's book, More Inner Secrets of Card Magic, written by Louis Ganson and published in 1960. But the professor was actually exploring this idea back in the 1920s. In 1930, Ralph W. Hull published a manuscript called Mental Discernment, which was essentially the same trick. At any rate, the original trick, the Vernon version of the trick, it's a wonderful trick. I mean, the spectator thinks of a card and you find it. Can't get simpler or better than that. However, there were some things about the Vernon version that I decided to change to work better for me. And that's what I wish to teach you now. The deck itself is ordinary. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a full deck. It just has to exist. The effect, if you recall from the performance, the deck is shuffled by the spectator, and I make a point of saying I will now do this without looking at the face of a single card. So that sets a rather challenging set of conditions. The spectator is now asked to think of a card as I show them one by one. Vernon and Hull showed 9 cards. I only show 6. But it doesn't feel like I'm showing too few. And let me explain how and why. First of all, I show the cards very slowly, but not to make it look like I'm stalling, just to make it look very deliberate. I show the cards, and as I show them, I flick the corner of each card so that it makes a sound. And that adds to the sense that this is being done very slowly and deliberately to be as fair as possible. And I explain the spectator is going to think of a card, and I show the cards one by one. And because I'm going slowly and deliberately, the spectator is motivated to think of a card among the first few that I'm showing. I show him a total of 6, and then as I go for the 7th, before the card is raised, I say, did you get one? And I never show him the 7th card. So he's seen only 6, but because the timing is extended, and because it's so deliberate, it feels like I'm showing more. And it also feels like I could keep going. In fact, the only time I would keep going is if the spectator says I didn't think of a card, which virtually never happens. But if that happens, okay, so now please think of one, and I'll show him the next 6 cards. So we're going to make it work regardless. Now, these 6 cards need to be controlled. Vernon inserted the cards into the front of the deck, jogged them to the back, and then shuffled to that jog. I chose not to do that because of 2 reasons. First of all, with only 7 cards, if I move that packet to put it into the middle of the deck, the audience sees the edge of the packet. And it's clear how small a group of cards that is. So I don't want to give them that visual reminder that I didn't show a lot of cards. But the second reason is that putting the cards into the center of the deck somehow looks like handling. It looks procedural in a way that I want to avoid. So what I do is, having taken the 7 cards off the top of the deck, I drop them back on top and then apparently lose them with a shuffle. However, I haven't actually lost them. And the reason is I have done a jog shuffle. And all that means is that I cut off about half the deck into my left hand. I do an overhand shuffle, but running only 1 card, and that's jogged back toward me. And then the other cards are shuffled off onto the in-jogged card, and not very neatly. So from the front, everything looks rather mixed up. But from the back, there's 1 card sticking out further than any of the others. That is my jog. And so if I now come back, press at the jog, I now can come back to bringing those 6 cards that the spectator looked at to the top of the deck. I continue shuffling in the following way. I shuffle 3 cards, drop the deck on top. That means that 3 of the cards that the spectator could have thought of are now on the bottom. I now shuffle off the next 3 cards, and then 7 more. I sometimes do 6, I sometimes do 7, I don't have a preference, I just have to know how many I've taken. So in this case, we'll work with 7. At this point, I could put the rest of the deck on top and then cut in one way or another to bring this group back to the top. But I think it's just simpler to lever this section up, throw the rest underneath, I'm done. So my situation is, I have 7 cards on top of the deck that are indifferent cards. They don't matter because the spectator's never seen them. I have 3 cards below that that are the second 3 cards the spectator was shown. And I have 3 cards on the bottom of the deck that are the first 3 cards the spectator is shown. Psychologically, the spectator usually thinks of one of the last 3 cards. So he usually thinks of the 4th, 5th, or 6th card. That's the better result because it means that it's going to be in the first group that I re-show. But I'll explain what to do if it's not the case. So, having shuffled the deck and making it clear that whatever card was simply thought of is now lost, I now am going to show the cards again. Now here I think this is important. When Vernon did it, he would fan the cards in groups, controlling which set of 3 was in which group. And he would say, do you see your card again? But frankly, there was never a very good reason to show the cards again, other than the method for making the trick work. And I wanted to make the concept of showing the cards the second time have some reason to it. So this is what I do. I say, I will now show you cards again from this shuffled deck. And this time, when you see the card you're thinking of, I want you to think stop And I will try to sense when you're thinking stop and stop there. That makes sense. So I show the cards again. This time I don't do the flicking, and I go a little bit faster. So I show the top 7 cards. Of course, none of these can be the spectator's card, because they're all from prior to what he saw. Having done that, when I come to the 8th card, which could be the one he's thinking of, I hesitate a little bit. So having done this with a fairly smooth action, I get to the 8th card and I do this, as if I'm sensing something, but I'm not sure. And then I go for the next one, and I stall a little again. And then the next one, as if I'm trying to catch something. And then I do several more, but the rhythm picks up again. And then I stop. And I say to the spectator, "Did you think stop?" Now, there are only 2 things he can say, either yes or no. If he says yes, I say, yeah, I sensed it, and I hesitated on that card. And because the 3 cards he could have thought of are the ones I hesitated on, he will interpret that as being accurate. And he will say, yes, you did. So I've done something rather amazing at that moment. And in that case, I will say, but I wasn't 100% sure. And then I say, do you remember precisely where your card was? And he always says no, because he has no reason to be counting. So he knows approximately that it's among the top 10 or so cards, but he doesn't know for sure, which is the answer I want. He says, I don't know, and I say, well, you do know, you just didn't register it consciously, but I'll try and get that card that you just subconsciously know about. And I give the deck to him. Now, Vernon did it by putting the deck on the table and taking cards off the top. I prefer to do it in the spectator's hand because it's more involving for the spectator. And it gives the audience a nicer picture, I think. So, as if I am somehow concentrating to try and pick up the location of the card, I take cards off the top one by one. And the first few, I do relatively fast, but I pause a couple of times as if I'm not certain. And when I've taken 7 cards, the next 3 cards are the ones that could possibly be his. Now remember, I said, I'm not going to look at the faces of any cards. Well, it's at this point in the routine that it turns out I was lying, because I'm going to look at the faces of 2 of those cards. But because I've put such emphasis on the fact that I won't look at the faces of the cards, I have to do those glimpses in a way that isn't detected. And the solution that I use is this. Having taken the 7 cards, I start to take the 8th card, but I hesitate. I actually move back and forth a little bit, as if I'm saying to myself, I'm not sure if I want to take that card or not. Maybe I should stop now, or maybe I should take one more. And after wavering, being uncertain, I impulsively grab it and take it. And in that action, because it's kind of a larger action, I can glimpse the card as it's coming off the deck onto the palm of my hand, but it doesn't look like I was doing anything because it's justified by the activity, by that behavior of saying, yes, I'm going to take it. And now I know that this, in this case, is the 5 of hearts. And then I make it a little more of the same story. And I normally say to the audience, I hate this part. I'm so tempted to take that card. And that allows me to make a bigger action on the second card. So I've now glimpsed 2 cards. And the 3rd card the spectator could have thought of is on top of the deck that he's holding. So now, apparently I've had this sort of fight with myself. Do I take one again? Do I not? And I get to the point that, okay, I'm going to stop here. For sure, I'm going to stop here. But what is the definition of here? Here could mean stopping here on top of the deck, or it could be stopping here on the last card I took. And that gets us to the end of the routine, because I say to the spectator, for the very first time, name your card. If he says, in this case, the 10 of spades, the card that I know is on top, then I will say, did I get it, or something like that. And the trick is over. I can even let the spectator turn it over, and that's particularly strong. If, on the other hand, it's the first card I saw, in this case, the 5 of hearts, I do a double turnover. And I say, you know, I almost didn't take this card, but I got it. And that's also a strong ending. But of course, my preferred ending is if it's the third card. And I know it's the third card because it's the card I don't know. If the spectator says a card, and it's one that I didn't glimpse, then it must be this card. And I can tell him, turn it over. I haven't even touched it. He turns it over, and there's the card he was thinking of, and the trick is concluded. Now, the question becomes, what about the cards on the bottom? Well, if the spectator has thought of one of the 3 cards on the bottom, that means that after I've shown the top 10, 15 cards, and I say, did you think stop? His answer is no. And I say, you know, I sensed that. I wasn't getting anything. And that makes sense within the behavior before, when I was showing them and trying to pick up something and not being sure. So it sounds perfectly okay. And I say, you know, let's try it a different way. And I shuffle the deck, and I do an overhand shuffle, but the last 3 cards I run singly, so that those 3 cards are now brought to the top. And I say, let's try doing it without looking at any cards. Not only will I not look, but even you won't look, because perhaps somehow intuitively you know where your card is. And as I'm saying this, I've just shuffled off 10 cards, the 3 that he could have thought of, and then 7 on top of that, and they go back on top of the deck. I'm now back to the exact situation I need, where the cards he could have thought of are located either in the positions 8, 9, and 10 from the top. So I now finish in the exact same way with slightly adjusted wording, because in this case, I can't say you subconsciously know the location. It's a little bit different. It's almost as if he intuitively or clairvoyantly knows, and I'm trying to pick that up. But the trick resolves in the same way. Over the years, I have not only done this in formal circumstances, in a restaurant or someone's home when there's a deck of cards, I have done this as a stage piece. And although it requires a certain amount of audience management to get them to pay attention and so forth, it's dramatically very strong. The plot is so clear and so explicit that even a large audience will accept this experience as being something dramatically valid. And I hope it works the same way for you. Two chairs, 2 people. And I think the first will be the lady. Can you join me, please? Have a seat in this chair. Hello. What is your name? Isabel. Isabel, thank you. And we'll need a man for this chair. I think, how about the young man from there? If you could sit here, you also get nice applause. Hello. What is your name? João. 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 Sort of, okay. We're going to try something, first over on this side, and then over on this side. Be patient, because I'm going to start with Isabel. And we will do this with a deck of cards. Now, we begin by having you shuffle the cards. Mix them any way you like. Okay? Very well done. I am going to deal the cards one by one, showing them to you. All right? As I do this, please remember one card, okay? Have one? Yes. Okay, shuffle them again. Now, João, I have to ask you, do you know what card is hers? Ah, good. If you knew, then you would be performing. So instead, we'll do it differently. Take your left forefinger. No, that's the right. This left. And touch a card as I spread. Just touch. Okay. Now take it and just hold it there. All right? All these possibilities. You have one card in mind. You have one card in your lap. In a big voice, what is your card?
Six of hearts.
Six of hearts. Show them. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This routine is something I began exploring in the mid-1980s, and it was a direct outgrowth of working on Out of Sight, Out of Mind. I wanted to see if there was a way to specifically force a card in the showing of cards one by one, as used in the Vernon effect. And this idea hit me, and it works. Now, if you recall from the performance, the spectators were sitting on chairs facing inward. It's actually the spectator who is on the right side whose position is important. The second part of the routine could be done with someone sitting in the audience. But this spectator needs to be facing such that his or her left profile is toward the audience. The deck is shuffled, and then I explain that the woman is going to think of a card as I deal through them, one by one. And I deal 10 or more cards. And I've now controlled what card she is going to think of. Because what is happening from her vantage point is this. As the cards are being dealt behind the first card, the only card the spectator gets to see is the one she's going to decide to choose. My wording is a little bit careful. I never say I'm going to show you a lot of different cards. I say I'm going to deal them for you one by one. And as I'm doing this, I wink at her with my upstage eye so that she understands that she's going to be an instant stooge and be in on the routine. I don't use the idea of instant stooges very often, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. But for right now, let's get to how we establish which card's going to be forced and a couple of other details. I force the top card of the deck. That's the first one that will be seen. But I let the person shuffle. What that means is that when I take the deck back from the person, I do a glimpse of the top card. That's an overhand glimpse, so that I can see the index, and that's done just in taking the cards back and making a momentary gesture. So I now know what card is going to be forced. In this particular routine, it's not important what the forced card is, merely that I know what it is. So in this case, we'll say it's the Ace of Clubs. I do this dealing to the woman, one card at a time. The only card she can think of is the one she sees. Now, what this grew out of conceptually is the reverse fan force. This is an idea first published by Henry Christ in the September 1936 issue of The Jinx. The idea, which had been used as a gag previously, but Christ actually made it into an effect. If you take a deck of cards and give it a reverse fan, the only card you can see is the card on the face. So the idea was you would fan the deck, show it to the spectator, say, think of any card you see, and then to give a good resolution to the effect, you would force that card on a second spectator. What this accomplishes is not only does it make it into a full routine by having that second phase, but it also adds an element of mystery for the first spectator. The first spectator knows that they are playing the part of an instant stooge, but they don't know how from a reshuffled deck, the second spectator picks the correct card. And that means that there is actually an effect for the first person, and that gives them more reason to not want to say to the audience, I can tell you how it was that I thought of that card. Now, the second part of this is a classic force, and that's an entire discussion of its own. So let's do that now. I'm going to force a card, and in the case of that routine, I would need to bring the card that was cited. In our example, it was the ace of clubs. I would need to bring it to where I need it. The deck has been shuffled by the person, if you recall, and as I'm walking over to the gentleman on the left side of the stage, I'm saying, you don't know her card, and you don't know where it is. And as I do that, I find the card. I don't make it look like I'm searching, but I casually spread the cards as if to say, look at all these different mixed cards. No one would have any chance to find out what it is. And as I'm walking to the guy, I simply cut the card to the bottom, and then I get into position for the classic force by either shuffling or cutting so that I'm now holding a break beneath the card to be forced. Now let's take a look at what that was like in the actual show. Take your left forefinger. No, that's the right. This left. And touch a card as I spread. Just touch. Okay. Yeah, just touch one. Okay. Now take it and just hold it there. All right? All these possibilities. Now, to help me with this explanation, I've invited Vanessa Viana to join me. Hi. Hi. And we're going to talk about the classic force. The classic force is a very, very old technique. Because it is difficult to explain, it probably existed for several hundred years before it was ever written. The earliest written versions are in the 19th century, but we can assume that it was already a couple of hundred years old by then. Now, there are different types of classic forces. The very basic concept of the classic force is easy to explain. You are holding a break, and the break is either above or below the card you wish to force. Now you spread the cards to a spectator and ask them to take a card, and as you are spreading, you push the card into their hands, but in such a way that it feels like they took the one that they wanted. That is the classic force. However, there are some adjustments that I have made over time, and it's a slightly different approach than most others. First of all, most performers who do the classic force use what I refer to as a rolling force. And what that means is that they push through the deck, the card passes at the point the spectator takes it, but they keep going. So the deck sort of rolls past the spectator, and the feeling they're trying to get is that the spectator reaches in like into a moving river, and they grab a card. This particular approach to the classic force was used by some of the great bar magicians. By the way, she did get the ace of clubs. Some of the great bar magicians, such as Kayfabe Al, Tom Mullica, did a beautiful rolling force. And this is, I think, the most common. On Paul Daniels' Bravura set, which was done for EMC in 2014, he teaches the classic force as he did it. And he makes a big point of saying, you have to keep going. Once they've taken the card, you have to keep pushing through. On a different set from EMC, the Danny D'Ortiz, he uses what he calls a rhythm force, where he's actually taking the cards in clumps and getting the person to reach over and take a card at the right time. And that works, but it's not what I'm going for. What I'm going for was influenced by Francis Carlyle, an American magician. I only saw Carlyle live once. I met him one time. He did a workshop, and it was extraordinary. And his classic force had a huge impact on me. Now, I never had the chance to discuss it with him. I saw what he did, talked a little bit about it, but what I really started working on after that was not necessarily what he did. It was what I remembered. It was the impression that I had. And the impression that I had from Carlyle was he spread the deck and then he locked. In other words, the feeling was not the moving river of cards, but that it was a static display. And from that static display, the person took any card they wanted. And to me, that feels even more fair because there are no moving parts. So that's what I set out to work on. And explaining it is not going to be easy. but I will give you as much as I can. First of all, again, I've got the brake and it's under the card. I don't like working with the brake over the card because when it's under, I have a tactile control. I can feel where that card is, even if I can't see it. So that's an important thing. I start the spread, and I tell the spectator to extend his or her left forefinger. Why? Why the left forefinger? It is because most people are right-handed. Therefore, the left hand is not their dominant hand. It's the hand over which they have less control. They're less certain with that hand. And that's an advantage for me, because I don't want them to be going, oh, I'm going to take this one. I want them taking the path of least resistance, and the fact that they're using their weaker hand helps me achieve that. The next important point is that I don't say pick a card or take a card. I say touch a card. First of all, that makes it easier because there isn't any grabbing going on at that moment, so it's a simpler interaction. There's another important reason for it that I'll get to. So I spread the cards. I say, I want you to touch a card, and now, just as they're starting to come down, I lock. So by the time they take the card, this is the visual that they will remember. That the deck was simply spread, and I waited. And the impression is that I stopped earlier than I actually did. And they, therefore, have the card. Now, the opportunity for making this more effective is enhanced by saying touch. Because if I say to you, I'll get the 8 of clubs now. If I say touch a card, now I'm locked, and now I say take it. And now, again, that puts a little more space between the moment I stopped and the moment she takes it, helping to, again, emphasize this idea that I didn't move, that I just held them steady. But there is yet another advantage on doing this touch rather than take, which is that if I get it wrong, I can adjust. Now, if you do the classic force for enough years, you pretty much stop getting it wrong. I would say I hit 99% of the time. That's good enough for me. But let's assume sometimes you might be just a little off, especially if this is new to you. So you want the opportunity to adjust. Let's make it very obvious. I'll use a card with a red back so that you can follow what's going on. And we'll do it first where it works. So I say, please just touch a card. And now she takes the card and we're done. But what if she takes a card that is 1 or 2 above or below that point? That can happen especially when you're in your early time of trying to do this. Well, this time please touch a card either to the left or right. Okay, touch a card. Okay. No, take it. Now, it was obvious because of the red back that I just shifted the position where she was touching. But if we do it without a red back, I'm going to have to try and force you to touch the wrong card. So let's say I'm going for the 10 of diamonds. All right, so I say, take your left forefinger, reach out and touch a card. Okay, no, take it. And now she's on the 10 of diamonds. So that distinction of saying touch a card and then no, take it, it feels like the spectator didn't do the proper thing, but it's actually giving me the chance to correct a slight mistake. Because if she is 1 or 2 cards above or below where I want, I pull back as if I was expecting her to remove the card, and then push back to position, but now I've changed the card she's above. So it's here, I come back here, I say, no, take it, and now I've simply placed the correct card beneath her finger. And this is something that, at this point, I don't have to use very often. As you are working with the classic force, it's something that you can have as a slight reassurance if you're worried about failing. That brings me to a discussion that I think has some value. I've talked about this in the past, but I'd like it to be on these DVDs as well. When people try to teach the classic force, they always give the exact same advice. The way to practice the classic force is you force a card when you don't need to force a card. So every time you have a card selected, even if it's for a trick that doesn't require a force, you do it. And that way it's safe, because if they don't take the force card, you can continue in a different way. That is how everybody learns a classic force and how everybody practices a classic force. And maybe it's the best way, because it certainly helps build confidence. But maybe it's not the best way. I got to thinking about this because I learned about Laurie Ireland, a Chicago magician, about 90 years ago, who was an expert in sleeving. In other words, in throwing objects from his hand up into his sleeve. And to practice sleeving, most magicians learn it using coins, and they always practice it the same way. They practice it standing over a bed. And that way, if they miss and the coin falls, it lands on the bed, which is soft so the coin doesn't roll, and they don't even have to reach all the way down to the floor. So it makes it easier if you miss to get the coin back and practice again. That's the standard way. But it's not how Laurie Ireland practiced sleeving. Laurie Ireland practiced sleeving using expensive coins. I don't know if they were 50-cent pieces or $1 pieces, but this was at a time when either of those values was a lot. And he practiced standing over subway gratings. In other words, the metal things of a subway on the street where there were slots. And if you dropped a coin, it would fall through the slot down into the subway station. You'd never get it back. And he practiced above subway gratings because it was very expensive to fail. And this made him get very good and very accurate very quickly. And it occurred to me that maybe that thinking could be a better way to learn the classic force. That instead of doing it when it doesn't count, of doing it whenever you need a card selected, and that way if you miss, there's no issue. Maybe it's better to only do it when you need to force the card. Maybe it's better to learn it by taking that risk and putting yourself in that jeopardy. If you learn the classic force, whether this one or any of the others, if you learn it, internalize it, and make it your own, it becomes a very dependable and trustworthy friend. We'll play a game, beginning with you shuffling. Mix the cards as you like. Very thorough. Now, you are going to touch 5 cards as they spread through slowly. So touch any card. This one, okay, I will move it forward. Touch another. This one, okay, that's 2. Touch a third one. That's 3. That's 4, and one more makes 5. So there are 5 cards that you have selected. I'm not going to look at them, but you are. I will show you those 5 cards, look at them, and decide on one. Once you don't take it, just think it. Have you got one?
Yeah.
Did you decide? Please don't change your mind, but you are thinking of a card. And even if I had been looking from the other side, I wouldn't know for sure which card you were thinking of. It's very fair. Especially now, the deck is mixed, so we don't even know the location of your card. I'm going to give the deck to you, and I will ask you to remove 5 cards. They don't have to be the same 5 as before, but one of them must be the card you are thinking of. The other 4 are bluffs. Fair? Okay. Take out 5 cards. Don't show the faces to me. Put them face down onto my hand. That's 1. That's 2. That's 3. 4 and 5. So at this moment, all that I know is that one of these 5 cards is the one you are thinking of, right? I don't know its name. I don't know where it is in the packet. And in fact, if I mix them a little more, now you don't know where it is in the packet. In fact, mix them again. It's completely fair? Good. I will ask you to think of your card. I think it's a red card. Am I right? Okay, if I'm right, you have to say so that everyone knows. Otherwise, they think I'm just teasing or something. I think it's a heart.
Yeah, it's a heart.
Okay. And I think... No, it's a small value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't say the value of the card, but give me a number from 1 to 5. What do you like?
Number that I like?
From 1 to 5.
Okay. 3.
3, all right. That's the third card. Yes? What was the card you were thinking of?
4 of hearts.
The 4 of hearts. Thank you. This is the second routine on this set that has been published previously. It appeared in the 1979 March issue of Pabular. It uses ideas that go back a very long time, but to the best of my knowledge, not used in this way. If you recall the performance, the deck is shuffled. In fact, it doesn't have to be a full deck, and it can be completely shuffled. And I tell the spectator that they're going to touch 5 cards as I slowly spread through. And that's what they do. And so 5 cards are chosen at random. Let's assume these are the 5. And now I make a big display, a wide display, so that the spectator can see all 5 of the cards that were touched. And I say, I want you to think of one of those cards. And in fact, at this moment, I have no idea what the cards are, and I don't know which one the spectator is thinking of. Now, I'm apparently going to lose these 5 cards in the deck by shuffling them into the deck. Actually, what I'm going to do is a form of multiple shift. Now, the multiple shift was first published for magicians by Di Vernon, who contributed to Arthur Buckley's book Card Control, which was published in 1946. There have been other multiple shifts in print both before and after. The version that I'm about to show you was created by Carmen D'Amico in the mid-1940s, and it appeared in print in Ed Marlowe's book, The Multiple Shift, in 1961. However, its roots go back to the 1930s. Dr. Jacob Daly kept notebooks during the 20s and 30s and into the 40s of card tricks and ideas. And he had an idea in those notebooks that were not published until decades later. And in November 1971, in Epilogue magazine, Carl Fulvis published what he called the Bevel Multiple Shift, which was the title that he gave to the idea of Dr. Daly for doing a multiple shift from the front end of the deck rather than jogging the cards from the back. The D'Amico version is easier, and I think it looks more casual. And the idea is quite simple. These 5 cards are now gathered at the front end of the deck. And now I apparently mix them into the deck using what is referred to as a Hindu shuffle. But what really happens is I tilt my right hand forward, and the block of cards above the jogged section falls forward onto my finger. I now strip out the deck, and that brings the 5 jogged cards underneath this section. But I continue shuffling, so those 5 cards are apparently completely lost. For this routine, I now shuffle a few cards to the bottom. I'm done. I say to the spectator, you take the deck. I want you to remove 5 cards. They don't have to be the same 5, but one of them must be the card you thought of. The others are bluff cards, null cards. Well, that's pretty clear. And all I do now is to watch where the spectator takes the cards from. Because the one that is removed from near the face of the deck will be the card he thought of. Because those 5 cards are located about 5 cards in from the bottom of the deck. So if the spectator were to do this, for example, I know that's not his card. If he moves to here, that's not the one he or she picked. But then here, that's their card. I know it. It doesn't matter which cards they take. I have to spot that one. Most of the time, it's very clear which is the spectator's card. Occasionally, very occasionally, the spectator may take two cards from the same, near the same place, in which case I've narrowed it down to two of the cards instead of one. That's not a problem, as I'll explain in a moment. But we have the situation where there are 5 cards on the table, the rest of the deck doesn't matter, and I know which one is the spectator's card. So let's assume that it was the second one he put down. I would take the cards from the spectator, and I can do it on a table. I can also do it that the spectator places the 5 cards into my open hand, so I don't need a table. And I play with the cards, apparently just to mix them a bit, so that the spectator no longer knows which card belongs to the spectator. But what I'm really doing is moving the card I know is the spectator's card to the bottom of the packet. And now I say to the spectator, so at this point, one of these cards is the one you're thinking of, but even you don't know which one it is, what location. And at that moment, I have glimpsed his card. I brought his card to the bottom, and when I do a gesture to say, you don't know, I now know the identity of the card. Well, from here, it's very simple. I can do whatever I want. I can reveal the card, or I can play with it more. I usually like to give the cards back to the spectator and say, shuffle them again. It doesn't matter to me. He shuffles them again. When I take them back, I do a glimpse of the bottom card in the action of taking them. And if it's the same card, which it's going to be 1 out of 5 times, I'm done. If it's not the same card, I will toy with the cards for a moment and move a different card to the face, and I'll glimpse it again. And if I have to, I'll glimpse all 5 cards. Actually, I can get it in 4, because if the first 4 aren't his, then the last one is. So after this byplay, I know the identity of his card, and I know where it is. And then it's up to me to decide how to finish this. Now, we taped a number of different versions. One possibility is getting him to name a position and having it turn out to be in that position. There's also the possibility of using a classic force with 5 cards. We've already discussed some ideas on the classic force, and it works almost the same when you're working with a small number. But also, I can do pure out equivoque. As long as I know which card is his, I can set the cards out onto the table and use equivoque techniques to get him to narrow it down to 1 card. When that card turns out to be his, the routine is over. So how you finish this is entirely up to you, and how you start was entirely up to me. Oh, you're wondering what to do if they take more than 1 card from near the face of the deck. As I said, it's not a problem. If there are 2 cards that could be their card, then I control both of those as I'm toying with these cards, and I glimpse both of them. So now I have it down to 2 cards, and I can pump which one it is. So in other words, if one of the cards is red and one of the cards is black, I would say, think about your card, it's a red card. If I'm right, I'm done. If I'm wrong, I say, oh, you're more difficult than I expected, or whatever. And I move on from there, because I have now made sure. What if they take all 5 cards from near the face? This almost never happens, but it can. What if it does? It's not a problem. Because, as I talked about earlier, I have no problem with glimpsing all of the cards in the course of toying with them. So I can learn what all 5 cards are. And then I can find out which one is theirs through pumping. And the pumping system that you would use in a situation like this is what Orville Meyer, back in the 1940s, published under the title The Principle of the Majority. And what that means is, in any group of cards, there are certain things that are majority principles. Here, 3 of these 5 cards happen to be red. So I would guess that the card is red. If I'm wrong, okay, I'm wrong, but now I have more closer information, because now I'm down to only 2 possibilities. If the card is red, well, we have 2 diamonds and 1 heart. So I can guess diamonds. I'm most likely going to be right, because there are 2 to 1 on diamonds. But if I'm wrong, I know exactly what the card is. So by making pumping statements about the card being high or low, red or black, the suit, the value being odd or even, all of these different details, and by using this basic concept of the principle of the majority, it is very quick and easy, even if all 5 cards are possibilities, which happens very, very rarely, but if it does, you can still get to a very good end, which this is. So, do you play cards?
Yes.
Oh, good. Would you take the deck and mix the cards really thoroughly? I can see you are a gambler.
No, not really.
When you are satisfied that the cards are really mixed, I want you to hold the deck behind your back. He's not satisfied yet.
I'm not a gambler, but I like to shop.
Okay.
It's okay.
Now you're happy. Put the cards behind your back. And without looking, I want you to remove one card and put it under you, so you are sitting on one card. Did you do it?
Yes.
Okay, so at this moment there is one card that no one knows, not even you,
Yes.
and it's fair. All right, give the deck to this lady. If you want, you can mix them again. Good. And then when you are ready, you put the cards there. I would like you to cut the cards, but it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle. It can be where you like. Oh, all right. So you cut to here. Pick those up. You can mix them again. And then I want you to fan the cards to yourself. Look at the cards. Hold them so I can't see the faces. And think of one. But you really have to see it, so make sure it's there. Did you get one? Yes. Good. Close the group. It's fair. These people were looking over your shoulder. They don't know which is the card you are thinking of. Set those there. I'm going to have you think of a card too. It'll be from this group. But in this case, I want to make it even more fair. So I'm going to show you each card one by one. And as I'm dealing the cards, you will think of one. Make sure you see it. But don't say, oh, I like that one, because then I will know. So just let me deal, all right? Can you see them here? It's okay? You are thinking of a card? Great. Nobody knows what card you are thinking of. I mean, the people with you, they didn't know, so I don't know. Please don't forget your card. Please don't forget your card. I'll begin with your card. Think of your card. Don't say anything, just think. It's a red card. Yes. It's a heart. No? Now I'm really not sure. I'll try it. I'll put the card there. What was the card?
It's 3 of...
Of diamonds, okay. A little trouble for me because you didn't know the name diamonds. But that's all right, that's all right. For you, I have to find the card you thought of from this group. That's a little bigger, so it's harder. Yeah, but I'll make it even harder. Now I have to find from all of these. I'll try. Think of your card. I may have trouble on this one. I don't want to ask any questions. I don't want to say, was it red or black? I think. What was your card?
4 of hearts.
Okay. One more to go. That's yours.
Yes.
But in your case, I cannot tell you what card you are thinking of because you're not thinking of it.
Yes, exactly.
You're sitting on it, but you don't know what it is. So I have no thought to take.
Yes.
So instead, we'll do this. I will turn away. When I turn away, I want you to take a look at your card. Don't show it to anyone else, but take a look, and then put it back where it came from. Okay? Let me turn away.
Yeah.
Okay? I can turn now and not see anything. Now you know the card. Now you can have that information that I can try to catch. But I cannot take your card from the deck because it's already gone.
Yes.
It's under you.
Yeah.
So I will do the next best thing. I will try to take the card that is the same color and the same value.
Okay.
I think that's fair.
Fair enough.
Okay, don't tell me anything. I think I'm close, but don't tell me. Don't tell me. This one. We'll find out. You were first. What was your card?
3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds. Turn it over, the 3 of diamonds. For you, you said it was the
4 of hearts.
4 of hearts, yes. And but now we have the last one, because I've been having this here. Can I have your card?
Face down.
Yep. Okay, it's easy to know which is yours. This one is warmer. But if we turn it over, it's the 2 of diamonds. If this card is the correct one, it should be
2 of hearts.
the 2 of hearts. Thank you. This routine has an interesting history. It uses a normal deck, and it's almost self-working. In 1976, Harry Lorraine published a manuscript called The Epitome Location, and this was a method for clocking a deck. Now, what that means is going through the pack and counting up all of the values of the cards to find out what is missing. The idea probably was first published in an untitled Italian manuscript written by Luca Pacioli in 1478, which is less than a century after the introduction of playing cards to Europe. Now, there are different ways of clocking. It was described in a different form by Jacques Ozanam in 1694. Probably the first time it was discussed in English was in Dr. William Hooper's Rational Recreations in 1744. This routine was developed after I had learned the epitome location from Harry's manuscript back in 1976, and I probably devised this around 1978. Although I don't recall it being directly influenced by a routine of Harry's called Triple Mate, I later saw that that routine is in the epitome manuscript, so I was probably influenced in creating this routine by that. In the 1980s, T.A. Waters and I discussed this trick, and he developed his own version. I saw it, I thought it was quite clever what he'd done, but I said that I would prefer that he not publish it because mine had not been released. However, in 1985, he published the effect, his version, under the name Carousel, which he put into a booklet called Mystics. And then later it appeared in his larger collection, Mind, Myth, and Magic, in 1993. In the pamphlet, there was a footnote stating that the effect was a variation on an idea of mine. In the bound book, that footnote disappeared. We had a very strange relationship. Anyway, there have been some other routines that are relevant to this discussion. Simon Aronson had a related idea, independently developed, that appeared as two minds and a mate in the Aronson approach, which was published in 1990. Pitt Hartling has a really interesting effect that's very related to this, called triathlon, which was in the Little Green Lecture Notes in 1998. This method makes use of clocking and a couple of other things, which we'll get to in a moment. But let's start off by a very brief explanation of clocking. There are different ways to clock a deck. The most obvious one is that you literally count every single value as you go through the deck, and then you wind up with a large total, and whatever is missing from the expected total is the card that is missing, or at least its value. Other versions have simplified the process. Harry Lorraine's version, which I'm not going to explain carefully, but I'll give you the brief idea, is that you are casting out tens, so that as you're going through the deck, if you come across, for example, a 9 and an ace, that makes 10, they are no longer part of the total. So as you're going through the deck, every time you get past the total of 10, you start the count lower. And if you do this with an entire deck, the end result, if it's a full deck, will be a total of 4. So if the total is different, let's say the total is 7, that means the card that is missing is a 7. If the total at the end is 6, the card that is missing is an 8. And so forth. I would strongly urge that if you want to try learning this thing, you get Harry's manuscript, which is still available. He republished it in one of his more recent classic collections. Carl Fulvis has also put out 2 or 3 booklets that have some really interesting work on this sort of thing. So it's worth tracking those down. This routine makes use of clocking in the context of a larger effect, and there's a little bit more going on. So we'll walk through the whole thing. The deck is normal. It can have jokers or not, as you see fit. It's fine. It's good if you know if there are jokers. It saves you a little bit of worry. And it has to be a full deck. But other than that, you can start with any circumstance. The deck is thoroughly shuffled. The spectator removes one card either behind his or her back or under the table, and then they sit on that card. So nobody knows what that card is, and the deck is then reshuffled. So now you've got a pretty impossible situation to begin with, that there's a card that's been taken that nobody knows. I ask a spectator to cut the deck, and what I want is for the spectator to cut off-center. So I simply suggest that. I say, please cut the cards, and you don't have to cut exactly in the center. The result is usually that the person cuts a smaller group. It doesn't matter what the relative sizes are. If he or she cuts dead center, that's perfectly fine. But if they cut a little off-center, it's a little better for me. I'm going to tell the first active participant, I'm going to give them the smaller group, whether it's the one they cut off or the one they left on the table. I'll give them the smaller group. And I'll ask them to fan the cards toward themselves and to think of a card. Pretty fair. Now, later, I'm going to guess what card they thought of. For real. And I'm going to do this based on some prior information. First of all, I know that in normal room lighting, not stage, but normal room lighting, people are more likely to go for a black card than a red card, just because the blacks are easier to see. So my first guess is that they're going to go for a black card, and it's probably going to be toward the left end of the fan, in the left half, somewhere around here. So from this group, my first guess would be the 10 of spades, and then assuming I was correct in it being black, if it's not a spade, I would probably guess for the 8 of clubs. But that depends on exactly what the makeup of the deck is. Obviously, this is why I'm going with the smaller group. It gives me fewer choices to have to make. I have done this with my back turned to the spectator, and with success. Having said that, I frequently watch casually as the spectator looks, because sometimes they'll give you a tell. You can see what portion of the fan they're looking at. They'll pause there. They might even break the cards a little bit there. And I'm going to use that to my advantage too. Having done that, this less than half deck is set aside. Now, for the second participant directly, I'm going to say that they're going to think of a card from this group, but they have to actually see it. And this time, to make it even more fair, I'll deal through the cards. And I deal through the face-up deck. And while I deal through the face-up deck, I am clocking the cards. So a queen has a value of 2 in the epitome system. So a 2 and a 5 is 7. A 9 makes it 6. A 7 makes it 3. Another 3 makes it 6. And then 8. A 10 doesn't count. 8 and 7 yields 5. So as I deal through, I am clocking the deck. The reason I'm dealing from a face-up deck is it gives me an extra advantage. Because not only am I seeing the cards as I deal them, I can see a few cards ahead on the group that's in my left hand. So if I see a useful combination, if I see a pair that add up to 10, I can just nullify those. So I can be working a little bit ahead, and it allows me to deal a little faster. It also means that if I've got a few cards ahead, I can actually look away for a moment as I'm dealing, which conveys the idea that I'm not studying the cards. And I do this all the way through the deck, or all the way through this group. So now I have a total for what this group has. It doesn't tell me what card is missing, but it gives me half the information. I'm going to have to come back to this piece of information, and I'm going to talk for a little bit before that happens. So I don't want to forget that number. So let's assume that this clock to was 5. Well, in that case, I would say, so at this moment you're thinking of a card and nobody knows what it is. And I've just cut a 5 to the face of this pack. And that is going to stay on the bottom of this group for later. So if I don't retain the 5, I can always add it later. Now, I say let's begin. We have 3 cards. You're thinking of a card from this group, you're thinking of a card from this group, and you're sitting on a card that nobody knows. I pick up the first group, and I go through it apparently trying to figure out the card that that first woman is thinking of. And when I do this, I clock the rest of the cards. So I'm pushing them over, I'm spreading them. It's no more or less difficult than dealing them. And when I continue and get to the very end, I now have a total for this group. So this could, for example, have a total of 2. To that, I add 5. Now, if I have retained the knowledge of the 5, that's great. I don't have to look. I can just tack it on either in the beginning or the end of this spreading. If, however, I'm not certain, that's all right, because I'll have a moment to check it. Having gone through this, I've now clocked. I now know the value of this card. Now, with the Lorraine system, there are some duplications. Jacks have a value of 1, queens have a value of 2, kings have a value of 3. So if you determine that the missing value is, let's say, a 2, it could either be a queen or a 2. I hope that makes sense. So now I have a value, and I know what this is, or at least I know what it's within a range of 2 values. Now I'm not done with holding these. Having clocked this, I will now go for the card that she is thinking of, or he. And I will do a little bit of pumping. I will go for what I think they're thinking of. So if, in our example, if they're thinking of the 10 of spades, I'll say, you're thinking of a card, it's a black card. And I get a yes or a no. If it's yes, then I would move on to say it's a high value, or perhaps that it's a spade. And I would determine from that either exactly what the card is, or I'm going to be very close. And I'm all right if I fail. because if I'm close, it's still going to work reasonably well, as I'll explain. So let's assume I ascertain that it's almost certainly the 10 of spades. I put the card down there, and I find out what the card was. I'm told it's the 10 of spades or something close, and we'll come back to that. I now say, your card I need to find from this group, which is a little bigger, so it's a little harder. Yes? And they agree. I say, no, it's much harder. And I shuffle these together. And it's at this point during this shuffle that if I need to, I can cite the bottom card of the larger half and correct my total. So it's there if I need it. Most of the time I don't need it. Now all of this is done fairly quickly. When I was doing this in the late 1970s and doing it every day, I could clock a deck in less than 20 seconds. My record was 16 seconds. Now, it's not something I do all the time, and it takes me closer to 40 seconds. But that's still reasonably fast. And the conditions of this routine are so impossible that the fact that it's taking a little time is not suspicious. So now, having put the first card on the table, I'm apparently going to put the second card on the table from the person I dealt the cards to. What I'm actually going to do is to spread through the deck and find out what this card is that's been sitting off to the side. Now, as it happens, this is a king that has a value of 3. If my total, therefore, was 1, I would know that the missing card is a 3, meaning it's either a 3 or a king. So I would look through the deck, and I would look at the 3s. And in this case, I would see there's a red 3, there's another red 3, there's a black 3, there's the other black 3. So the card over here is not a 3. But I had a 50% chance that it was. If it's not a 3, then it's a king. So now I go back and look again. This is all very quick. And I look for the kings. There's a red king, there's a black king. Whatever the remaining king is the other red king. So I now know that the card I need to put on the table is the black king that mates with the card that's underneath the spectator who's sitting down. So that is put here. Ostensibly, this is the second selection that I have managed to find out. I ask the person what card they were thinking of, and they tell me. And I react. I should, after all, in both cases, I should give some indication that, okay, that's good. And now I say to the person sitting on the card, you are thinking of a card, but you don't know the name of the card. You're just thinking about where it is. It's underneath you. So there's nothing in your mind for me to read. So let me turn away, and you take a peek at that card and put it back. They do that. I say, now you have a card that you're thinking of. But I can't take that card out of the deck because it's not in the deck. So I'll do the next best thing. I will take out the card that is of the same color and the same value. Now, in this case, I've already done that because the other black king is over here. So what I'm really doing is taking out the card that the second spectator thought of when I dealt through the deck. So if they told me that they thought of the 2 of spades, so I look through the deck, and what I do sometimes is I'm apparently finding the mate to the card that the person's sitting on. So I'll stop on, for example, another king, but a red one, and I'll show it to the person saying, I think I'm getting close. Well, this is close. It's a king, which is the value he's thinking of, but it's not the right color. So I don't get him to confirm or deny, but frequently he'll give a response like, it is close. There'll be some visual reaction on his face that gives a little more texture to the event. At any rate, I now go back and find the card that the second spectator named. I go through and I find the 2 of spades that she named, and I set it down. But I set it down overlapping the second card in the group. And that's of some importance. The rest of the deck is not important. It can be put away. We're just down to these 3 cards plus the one the person is sitting on. And now it's time to recap, go through what's happened, and show the 3 cards. The first card, thought of by the first woman, or man, was, in our example, the 10 of spades. So I get her to repeat what her card was. She says the 10 of spades, and what I normally do is I take my right forefinger and I push the card forward toward her or toward another spectator, and I say, turn it over. But as I do that, my left thumb touches the third card and pushes it over, changing the arrangement of these two cards, so that what was this situation becomes this situation. And what was the second and third cards put on the table are now the second and third cards. All that happens in just a moment as I'm reaching forward to push this card to the spectator turns it over. If it is the card that was thought of, the 10 of spades, great, we've got a very strong thing. If it's not the 10 of spades, if it's, let's say, the 9 of spades or the 8 of spades, I'm okay with that. Because if we think about the conditions that are being emphasized about the fact that the person merely looked at a card and thought of it, to even get close to that is pretty amazing. So I'm content to live with that slight danger that this card is going to be a little off. But in fact, the more you try this, the more often you'll find that you're right. Now here, of course, because we've switched the order of these two cards, we're now we're making use of the one-ahead principle. This is a principle that has been around for a very long time. The earliest example that is known is in the Horacio Galasso manuscript from 1593. So it's got a long history to it. We are now at the point where both of these cards are going to be correct. The second person is asked again to remind us what card was thought of. In our example, it's the 2 of spades, and either I turn it over or I let a spectator turn it over, and it is the 2 of spades. And then for the last one, I hold the card that I've put down. I ask the person to hand me the card from underneath them that they've been sitting on. I show this card and get them to say, okay, if in fact your card was the King of Spades, then what should this card be? And since hopefully I've explained it clearly, they will say it should be the King of Clubs, which gives me a very nice pose for the finish, because this is a kind of ta-da pose in a close-up circumstance, framing my face and putting all of the applause at that moment. Just to be clear, let's clock a deck. And I'll do this a little slower than I would do it in actual performance. A card has been removed from the deck, which has been shuffled yet again. And to keep to the conditions of the roundabout routine, the deck is cut. This less than a half pack is set aside. We're going to deal through these cards, and I will clock them out loud. So we have a 9 plus a 2. The queens are 2. So 9 plus 2 is 11. We throw away the 10. That gives us a count of 1. Plus 7 is 8. Kings are 3. 8 plus 3 is 11. We're back to 1. Jacks are 1. Now we're at 2. 5 is 7. 7 and 6, 13. So 3. The 10 doesn't count. We're still at 3. Plus 2 is 5. Plus 3 is 8. Plus 7 is 5. Plus 3 is 8. Now I can speed things up a little bit. I'm at a total of 8 here. I see that there are 2 4s. So instead of counting them separately, I can simply call that 8. 8 plus 8 is 16. We're at a total of 6. There's a 10. It doesn't count. There's a 9 with a 1 next to it. That's a 10. It doesn't count. We're still at a total of 6. Plus 1 is 7. Plus 8 is 15, therefore 5. Plus 3 is 8. Plus 6 brings it to 4. 10 doesn't count. 4 plus 8 is 12, so that's 2. Becomes 7. Plus 9 becomes 6. Plus 1 is 7. Plus 3 is 10, so we're back to a 0. 6, joker doesn't count. Plus 8 is 14, therefore 4. Plus 2 is 6. So the running total, the finished total for this half of the deck is 6. I will casually cut a 6 to the face of this so that I can come back to it later if I need to. Now we'll clock the rest of the deck, but we'll do it by spreading. And what I'm looking at goes as follows. That's 10, so it's nothing. Then there is a queen, which is 2, 4, plus 9 is 3, 7, plus 9 is 6, plus 6 is 2, 3, 5, 7. 7 plus 5 is 12, so we're at a 2. There's a 3 and a 4. 2 plus 7 brings us to 9, plus a 3 brings us to 2, plus 3 is 5. That with the 7 comes to 12, so it's 2, plus 1 is 3, plus 9 is 2, and then to 3. So I have this group totals 3. And remember, this group totals 6. Adding those together gives me a grand total of 9. This deck has clocked to a result of 9. What that tells me is the value of this card is the normal end result, which is 4 or 14, minus 9. 14 minus 9 is 5. This must be a 5. Now, by going through the deck once, I can see there's a black 5, and then a red 5, and then the other red 5. Therefore, this must be the other black 5.
So I'd like to start this section with a line that was written by Stuart James when he first saw you in the late 70s. He wrote to Francis Exton saying that you really made an impact, and I wouldn't have the nerve, much less desire, to parade around looking as he does. It seems to be working for him. So how did you get the nerve and the desire and the strategy to become Max Maven?
I never saw that comment by Stuart, so that's kind of nice to know. It was where I first met him, was at the Abbott's get-together in 1978. And then I met him several other times in Chicago and in Courtright, Canada, which is where he lived. An amazing man. We could talk a lot about him. But you want to hear about this. From early childhood, I was very drawn to kind of dark, weird, sinister images. One of the images I really liked was Ming the Merciless, who was the villain in the Flash Gordon comics and serials. And Ming had this strong widow's peak. It was actually a cap, not his hair, but it had the look. And there were others. There were many of the depictions of Dracula and vampires had that same kind of look, and just generally Mephistophelian imagery. And then as I continued in my teens, I began to learn about people like Dunninger and Anneman, who both had widow's peaks. And I felt very cheated by life that I didn't have a widow's peak, that my hairline was straight across. And I would say, why didn't I get that? And then at some point in the late 60s or very early 70s, I came across the information that Anneman had a straight hairline, and that he shaved the front of his hair into a widow's peak, probably inspired by Dunninger. And this had never occurred to me that this was an option, that this was a possibility. You know, today people do all sorts of completely strange things with their hair. They shave shapes into the hair, but this wasn't the case back then. And so I thought, wow, I could do that, but I didn't have the courage to do it. And so I waited 3 or 4 years, or maybe more. And when I was at this disco and had reached the point of announcing that I was going to leave, and by then I had shifted pretty much into the idea that I was going to do mentalism and not stand-up magic. It was at that point that I said, maybe I'll do the hair. And there was a customer at this disco who had a women's hair salon. And so I said to him, is it possible that you could shave my hairline? And he thought a moment, And he said, yes, but we'll have to do it at 8 o'clock in the morning because my shop opens at 9, and I don't want any customers there when I'm doing this because it'll freak them out. So on a day that we'd agreed upon, I took the bus to his shop, and when I came out of the shop an hour later, I had the hairline. And people told me I was crazy. People said, this is a terrible idea, which maybe it was, but I've had it ever since.
So first was the airline, and only later comes the change of the name.
The name change actually came just before the hair, because when I got the job in the disco, as I was trying to enter show business, I had already decided to change my name. Because Phil Goldstein is not a very good or memorable name. For Americans, it's sort of the equivalent of John Smith, a generic name, except Jewish. But that doesn't help. I mean, people would say, oh, I met this guy, Paul Greenberg. It was an easy name to lose. So I wanted something more dynamic. So I picked Max because at that time, the name Max had ended in the US. So it was only a name for very old men. And there was no one of my age who had that name. Now it's become popular again, but at that time, so that if people were talking about Max, it was easy for that to be only me. And Maven took a little longer to come into existence, but I chose it. Partly, it's a Yiddish word that means expert, but it can be used very sarcastically. So you can say with great respect that someone is a wine maven, for example. But you can also say about someone, oh yeah, he thinks he's a real maven. Depending on how you express it, it's not necessarily flattering. And that appealed to me. It was funny that it could mean kind of a very bold statement, almost arrogant, I am an expert, or it could be, I'm not taking myself all that seriously. I also liked the fact that the two names begin with M-A, so there's a nice alliteration. And it's only 8 letters long, which means you can get it bigger on a marquee. So all of these reasons made sense, and when I started working at the disco, it was under that name. And gradually, everyone, including the magicians who had already known me under the other name, adjusted and adapted to calling me Max.
But both names coexisted for a long time.
Well, I did something very stupid, because I changed the name somewhere around 1975. 74 probably. But I'd published my first magic in 1965. So it had been about 10 years. Now, when you're in your 20s, 10 years seems like a very long time. So I said to myself, I'll change my name for all the things that I do as a performer and even in normal life with romance or with socializing. But I can't change the name that I publish tricks under because it's already established for 10 whole years.
Too much.
Well, it was a foolish choice, but I continued using the two names. But the Phil Goldstein name was only being used for when I was explaining magic in a book or a manuscript or a trick. And over time, it became more and more complicated. First of all, because some people wanted to talk to me under that name because they thought, oh, this is how I'll talk to him to show that I'm on the inside. And the easiest way to show that you're not on the inside would be to use that name when you address me, because I don't respond to it. When I talk to myself, I say, well, Max, you shouldn't have done that or something. That's how I think of myself now. But also, I did some projects where I was both performing and explaining with lectures, or in the case of the first videos I put out. And now the question was, well, this is explanation, so it should be under the Phil Goldstein name. But I'm performing, and so it should be under the Max Maven name. So this became difficult, that there were times that I had to make choices and it was awkward. So finally, in 2005, which was the 40th anniversary of my publishing magic and the 30th anniversary of changing the name, I said, okay, we will kill off the Phil Goldstein name entirely. And the book that documents that is Prism. Because as you can see, it says Max Maven Prism, whereas the books that I had published prior to that used the Goldstein name. But on the back cover, it shows the original covers of the pamphlets that were put out between 1976 and 1980, and all of those use the other name. So this was essentially the first document that that broadcast both names, and it was a way of saying goodbye to this name.
Well, but going back to the 70s, where you make the decision of the looks, the persona,
Yeah,
the character, the trend was kind of the mentalist being the ordinary guy, like Kurski and Geller. How do you get drawn to this superpower, strange character?
Well, I don't think my
fantastic?
character has superpowers, but I do think my character is strange. One thing that's important to know is that when I decided I'm going to be a mentalist in my early 20s, when I gradually moved into that place, at that time I had never seen a live mentalism show. So all of my ideas were coming from other sources, some from literature and print, and some from just trying to imagine what things would be like. The issue of what a mentalist should look like, or how a mentalist should behave, was a moot point. I didn't know. One answer I've given when people have said, why do you groom yourself this way? And it's not the complete answer, but it's not a bad answer, is I say, if you're going to be in the world of magic or mentalism or mystery performance, what you're really doing, in a sense, is exploring dreams. And if you're going to do that, you might as well start with your own. And as hard as it may be to believe, I dreamt of looking like this. It was a gradual process. It's still a work in progress. When I first did it, hair was not very long. I was clean shaven. And then not too long after that, I grew a full beard, which was slightly shaped. And then eventually it became a goatee. And after some time, the center disappeared. Then the center of this disappeared, and the shaping changed a bit. In the early 70s is when I got the ear piercings, which at the time was rather shocking for most people. I used to wear eye makeup every day to walk down the street. And when I think back to that, and how that must have registered to most ordinary people in the 1970s, it's amazing I wasn't killed. But I chose to do it.
Well, on the conversation we just had on the previous disc, we went through your youth and your teens, and we didn't mention something that I don't know, but I'd like to know if it had impact on the persona you became later, which are the difficult youth and the contact with depression and all those dark sides that each now and then you decide to share with us. And I would like you to remind us of the impact that might have had.
I think, and I've written about this before, I think that most magicians enter into magic in the same way and for the same reason. First of all, in the West, most of them are men. Well, boys. That's changing, slowly, but it is changing. It has tended to be a male profession, but that's because of patriarchy, because magic is a power profession, and women have not been encouraged to be in power professions. So it's not only true in magic. In religion, Catholicism and other religions, women are not allowed to be priests, and in things like the law and the government, it's only a relatively recent phenomenon that there are women in top positions. In the film industry, in the entire history of the Academy Awards, there's only been one woman who's ever been given the director Oscar out of so many years. So these are power professions, and magic is also one, and women have not been made to feel welcome. Although, as I say, that's clearly changing, and there are right now more women doing magic than perhaps any time ever before. But most men, most males, enter into magic in the same way. I think women probably enter in a slightly different way, but males enter into magic somewhere usually between the ages of about 8 and 12. And they begin in magic because they realize that magic is a very useful coping mechanism for dealing with some form of social and or psychological maladjustment. They're having a hard time dealing with their parents or their siblings or their teachers or their classmates, and they realize that magic gives them leverage, because if I can make the coin disappear and mom doesn't know where it went, the teacher cannot replicate that, then I suddenly have more control over my life. So I think that's the early appeal of magic to most magicians. Now, for most who start in magic, when they hit puberty, they find other interests and they leave magic behind. For those of us who don't drop magic, many stay in magic for the same reason. And so when they are 30 and 40 and 60, they're still doing magic for the same reason. And that's why you have people who come to a party with all this stuff in their pockets because they're so afraid they can't have a good social interaction or a conversation. They need to have the backup of these tricks and props. Some of us, I'd like to think I'm one of them, find other things about magic to explore and other motivations. But that early motivation is not only almost universal, but it's completely true in my case. I had a pretty unhappy childhood, not because I was abused, not because I was poor, because I was neither of those things. But when I was 5, my father got a job at a university, and for that reason we moved to a new place. And this was a little town called Auburndale, which was in the suburbs of Boston. And at that time, I didn't fit in. First of all, when I went to kindergarten, which was that year, I was brand new. So it's always awkward when a new kid comes among a group of kids who know each other. But there was more. I was born in late December, which meant that I was always the youngest in my class. That affected things. At that time, the city of Auburndale had almost no Jews. In fact, it was almost all WASPs, which is to say white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, people from Northern European heritage who were Protestants by religion and who looked a certain way and had a certain background. There were 2 or 3 Asian families, there were no black families, and there were maybe a handful of Italian or Irish Catholics. But the vast majority of these people had grown up going to the same churches and involved in the same things. So even before school began, they felt like they were a community. And suddenly I was there, and I was younger and smaller and darker than most of these kids. And so I was very much an outsider. Not 100%, but in very many real ways. Kids develop pecking orders, which is to say they very quickly decide when they're in a group, whether it's a classroom or something else, who is the most important person, who's the alpha, who's the beta, and who's below that. And for most of my childhood, I was on the very bottom, always. It also was affected by the fact that I wasn't good at sports and not interested in sports, so that helped to keep me in that position. So I'm not trying to paint an overly dramatic picture. I was able to make some friends, I wasn't completely isolated, but I didn't feel like I belonged fully. I didn't feel like I was fully comfortable or fully accepted. So magic, in many ways, appealed to me for exactly what I said before, because it was a way of getting some leverage and some strength in interacting with people. And when I began to find out about the actual world of magicians, which it was several years before I was able to set foot in that world, but when I began to realize that it existed and that there were people that I might someday be able to meet and exchange ideas with, that saved my life in some ways.
How much did the character Max Maven left behind those origins and move on into a new outline? Does it keep evolving nowadays?
Well, the character was built both externally and internally. You know, there are 2 basic approaches to acting. There's the British approach, which is external, and there is the Russian approach, which is internal. You can describe this like sculpture. There are 2 ways to make a sculpture of an elephant. The one way is you take clay and you add clay and add more, and you start adding details that look like an elephant until finally you have a sculpture of an elephant. The other way is to start with a big block of stone and cut away everything that doesn't look like an elephant, and you get the same result. They both work. The British way is carving from outside. That has now become one of the 2 standard ways of approaching acting. whereas the Russian Stanislavski way is you start on the inside and you build from. And I've done both. Certainly the image with the makeup and with the hair and the way I dressed, which is not exactly the same now as it was years ago, but it's always been not standard. And these are external things, but they come from an internal desire. So it's hard to say which is a stronger impulse, the influence of outside things and working on the exterior, or the influence of my personal passions and goals and interests. I think it's simultaneous.
How do you combine that, like, for instance, on stage, you can be extremely scary, but always enormously kind to your spectators? How does that balance come to be controlled and kept?
Well, that's kind of two different things. The scary element is an effective way of producing dramatic tension. I want my audience to be uneasy to some degree. I want them to think that I'm strange and different. You know, in that sense, I've taken what was my childhood situation and turned it into something good. You know, embracing the strangeness rather than
Fighting it.
I use humor in my work extensively. I use things that are not simply about scariness and dramatic tension, but that's a very strong element, and I don't want to lose that. The issue of being kind to the spectators who participate is not as overt, and many people don't even notice it. I'm very careful when someone comes onto my stage, because I know that most people have never been on a stage before, and it's very unnerving for them. It's scary for most people. Not so much scary as this weird guy, but scary just being on a stage. They've done surveys of Western people to find out what they're most scared of. And above dentistry and hospitalization and all these, you know, flying in an airplane, the number one answer is public speaking. And here you're getting someone who didn't plan on it to be in that position. So although I may be sarcastic or even scary in the way I relate to the audience, first of all, I'm trying to be careful in measuring it out. I'm not always correct. Sometimes I'm a little off. It's like walking on a tightrope. But I try to be very careful about how much. And sometimes in the middle of a show, I recalibrate and I say, oh, that last line sounded harsher than was good. So I'll be a little softer in the next few moments. But whenever a person comes on my stage, I am really nice to them, even if on the surface it isn't obvious. And some people don't notice it. Magicians don't notice it. I've seen lots of conversations on the internet from people who say, oh, Max Maven, he handles his spectators so harshly. Well, they're not paying attention. One of the nicest comments I ever got from an audience member, I was doing a nightclub in Chicago in the 1980s. And after the show, a woman came up to me. She was, I would say, middle-aged and nicely dressed, so a woman of some culture. And she came up to me, and instead of saying, oh, it was a great show, or I was very surprised, or whatever, she just came up and she shook my hand and she said, you were so compassionate. And although she didn't elaborate, it was very clear that what she meant was that she had perceived how careful I was with the people once they came on stage. I'm willing to be less kind to a member of the audience. I tease people when they're on stage with me sometimes, but very, very carefully, because they are part of the show, and as such, they have earned the right to keep their dignity and to know that they're safe, that I'm not going to let them get hurt.
You mentioned recalibrating through a show,
Yeah.
and I'm sure those adjustments have happened throughout your the development of your character. And you once told me that at a certain time, you, for instance, would create the rule of not smiling on stage.
Well, that was a very brief experiment. It was not a successful experiment, but I think it was a necessary experiment. And to tell you this, I need to pull back a few years. In 1977, at a magic convention, I met Ned Rutledge, who was an American inventor of mentalism, whose stuff I became aware of in the late 60s, and he actually had stuff in print in the 40s and 50s. And he was just a really sharp guy, and we hit it off and began a nice friendship. The next year, there was a big convention in New York, and I performed a matinee for the ladies, and I did a lecture. And I got Ned into the ladies' show to stand in the back, because he'd never seen me do a full performance. So I did about I think a 1-hour show, and then I also did a lecture of probably an hour as well. And later point in the convention, he said to me, you know, I really liked your show, but I liked the you in the lecture more. And it was because in the lecture I was closer to how I now behave on stage. There was more humor, there was more texture, there was drama, but wasn't endlessly so. So that began to affect my stage behavior. That one comment was a real strong impact on my performing style, but I was still exploring. And there was a period a few years later, I'm guessing 1980, when in trying to analyze mentalism, I came to this concept that if you were in a room with a real mind reader, someone who could actually probe into your thoughts, you would be uncomfortable. So I thought, I think I need to work at making my audience uncomfortable as an element in my show. So for a period of only about 2 months, I made a rule that I would never smile during a performance. Now, there were still some moments of humor in the show, but I would never display that in my face. And it was effective, but it wasn't good. Because what I realized after measuring the audience response and such, people were saying, wow, that was amazing, that was fantastic, and I don't want to ever experience it again because it was so stressful. So when I realized that, I made modifications. But it was an important thing to have tried. I think I learned a lot from that on the journey toward figuring out who the hell I was. So this would have been, you know, as I said, 79 or 80, so I was in my late 20s. And it was a very brief period, but there have been repercussions ever since, because there are people who have never seen me work or have only seen snippets on TV or something who say, oh, Max Maven, he has no sense of humor and he's so heavy and strict. And, well, that just means that either they haven't seen much of my work or they're not paying attention.
So nowadays, mentalists would justify their actions and the feats they do by NLP and psychology, non-verbal language. What are Max Maven powers?
Well, I was one of the pretty early people to take not NLP, but the psychological rather than psychic approach. Never made claims that I could be telepathic or precognitive. I never used the word psychic in any of my billing, except when I was working comedy clubs. Occasionally I would use the billing, the psychic comedian, but that was in quotes, so it clearly wasn't a strong claim. So I'm not going to say I was the first to say this is based on psychological principles, but I was in the early wave of that type of thinking in the very early 70s, when I was starting to build who I was and what I was trying to do. I rarely talk explicitly to the audience about what I'm doing in terms of how it's being done. When I do, either from stage or because someone talks to me after a show, I only claim 3 things. And they're all true, by the way. I claim that I can assess a person's behavior, their body language, their attitude, knowing statistics about people, and through these means I can gauge the direction in which they're thinking. So what can very loosely be determined as mind reading. Very loose use of the term. I also claim I can do the reverse, that by using psychological techniques, I can steer people's thoughts and do what we might call mind writing. And the third thing is I claim I can think more quickly than the average person and employ abilities with memory and calculation and other thought processes that are above normal. Well, all of that's completely true. I just never mentioned the fact that I'm willing to cheat to get to the end result. And one day, years ago, I was sitting with James Randi, who was a friend of a long time, and I stated these three claims to him. And I said, do you have any problem with any of those? He said, none at all. So I think at this moment, I can still say this with confidence, I think I'm the only person alive who can say with certainty, if you were to call James Randi right now with no preparation and just say, hi, what's your opinion of Max Maven? He would say, well, he's a friend. I like him. And if you were to call Uri Geller and ask the same question, you'd get the same answer. And I think I'm the only one who has a comfortable relationship from both ends of that spectrum.
Well, speaking about different ends of the same spectrum, there is a dialogue in Genie magazine in 1981 between Phil and Max.
Yeah.
And Phil said, those cheap little pamphlets have paid the rent plenty of times when you, Max, couldn't find a stage to walk on.
Yes.
Well, I would like to talk about these two things. First of all, the prolific creation of the pamphlets and the packet tricks on one side, and then the other, on the other end, when you became a star on stage, and then now you are incredibly busy performing as Max Maven and probably just creating on some other times that you are not performing.
In the early 1970s, having gotten more experience in the world of magic events and organizations and conventions and magazines and all that sort of network, and I had published stuff in magazines, and I began to see that there was an opportunity to market some things. So I marketed, my first trick that was actually sold was a trick called Full Circle, which was marketed by a small dealer in Massachusetts. I didn't get very much money for it, but it was fun to have it as a thing, and in the early 70s is when I did my first attempts at lecturing, and it was also during this period that I met Hank Lee, who was about the same age and who was just about to open his magic shop. So I was engaged by Hank to be a demonstrator from literally the first day his business opened, and continued that for several years in the early to mid-70s. It meant I was demonstrating magic behind the counter, but I was also writing the advertisements. I drew the little picture of him. I had nothing to do with the criminal behavior that came later. But it was at that time, because Hank was marketing stuff, that I wound up making arrangements with him to market some of my tricks, because in the early 70s, packet magic suddenly flourished. Now, there are examples of packet magic going back hundreds of years, but modern packet magic only goes to really in the 1940s and 50s is when it really starts to build. And through the 60s and then by the early 70s, suddenly it was a big thing. And people would come into magic shops and say, what's the new packet trick? And a lot of them were things that I invented. One of the other big inventors of packet magic at that time was Larry West, wonderful creator. And I was in the Washington, D.C. area visiting Larry for a couple of days, and we were sessioning and having a nice time. And at one point he looked at me and said, you know, if a bomb falls on this house, Nick Trost will have it all to himself, because the three of us were producing such a large percentage of the packet magic. So that's what got me into that. And then in 1976, I published my first mentalism pamphlet and also my first card pamphlet, and things continued from there. The attempt to make a living performing was less under my control. When I left the disco and started looking for work as a mentalist, initially it was really hard. There were periods where I was making no income. I had to borrow money from my parents just to pay my rent, and it wasn't very much rent in those days. And I would get an occasional gig through a friend, or sometimes I would go to agents, and they usually said, we have nothing, but occasionally something would come through. And then one day, I was walking down the street in Boston, and I ran into Frankie, the guy who had hired me to be a DJ. And he said, Max, how are you? How's the thing going with your trying to be a full-time performer, doing this mentalism stuff? And I said, well, it's terrible. I'm starving. I'm getting almost no work at all. Oh, he said, I'm sorry to hear that because I think you're good. I've seen you do some stuff. So he said, you know, I've moved. I'm no longer at that first club. I'm at a different club owned by the same people. And it's a little jazz club called Pooh's Pub. And he said, we do mostly jazz, but on Tuesday nights, we have a talent contest. And we have singers and comedians and variety artists. You should come to that because there's a $50 prize. And at that time, $50 was not a small amount. And he said, and I've seen the quality of your work, so you'll probably win. It's voted by the audience, so why don't you come and do that? And I said, well, that's very nice of you, and I appreciate it. But $50 one time, I mean, that's really not going to solve my problems. And he thought for a moment and said, okay, I'll pay you $30 to MC the show. And I did, every week. And many weeks, that was my only income, was that $30. But during those shows, in between the acts, I was able to experiment and break in material. And it was fantastic to have that opportunity. One of the things that some of the older performers used to say, those who had come up in vaudeville, by the time it reached the 1960s and 70s, some of the old-timers would say, you know, the problem that young performers have is that they have no place to be bad. Because in vaudeville, you could go to the small towns, and when you got better, you'd work the better theaters in the bigger towns, and you could grow into it. Well, I found a place to be bad. It was called Pooh's Pub. I don't think I was terrible, but I was learning as I was doing it, and I was getting paid. Not a lot, but some. And then, after that, the Playboy Club in Boston, for a summer, had an open mic situation for the late show on Friday and Saturday. So for the late show, which was at like 10:30 or 11 at night, there was a comedian who hosted the show, but then they would let other people, most of them comedians, do like maybe up to 8 minutes. I was the only one of the young performers who came every single Friday and Saturday, even though it paid nothing. And in fact, it cost me money because by the time the show was over, the subway had stopped running and I would have to pay for a taxi. So it actually cost me money to work there. But it was so valuable to work for real audiences. So I had these two places I could work, and I was starting to get gigs elsewhere. So I was at Pooh's Pub for a year. And by the time that year was over, I won't say I was great, but I wasn't bad. And I had learned a lot because halfway through that year, Frankie said, you know, this talent contest, it's getting stale. We're getting the same people. So we're going to end that. But I still want to keep you. So he kept me and a singing duo. And we alternated 1-hour sets. And I got a raise to $35 a night. So every Tuesday, I was doing 2 hours of material. So I was able, during that 6-month period, to break in a lot of stuff. About 1978 is when the comedy boom started in the United States. There had been comedy in the US, of course, but around 78 is when nightclubs started opening. They started sprouting like mushrooms. And it became quite quickly that every major city had several of these clubs. Even smaller cities would have at least one. So there was a whole circuit. And I jumped in. Now, the normal frame, the normal structure of the shows in these clubs were 3 acts. There would be an opening act who would do about 15 minutes, 10 to 15, and also MC the show. Then there'd be a middle act to do between 20 and 30 minutes. And then there'd be the headliner who would do anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour. The opening spot paid almost nothing. The middle spot paid a bit. The headline spot paid pretty well for the standards of that time. I was able to enter as a headliner because I had some credentials. because in between Pooh's Pub and the comedy clubs, I had done some traveling. I had started working some of the Playboy clubs that still existed. I'd worked the Magic Castle during that period. And I'd been on national television. I was on a talk show. And all of these things meant that I didn't have to do what most people did, which was to start in the lowest place and then work to the middle and the top. So I started as a headliner and continued for the next 13 years. And I did quite well in comedy clubs, even though I'm not a comedian. In fact, in most of the clubs, I set records. Sometimes it was the best Thursday they ever had, or the most drinks they sold on a Friday, or whatever it might be. The reason I set records is because I kept changing the show, because I kept adding more material to my repertoire. And so I would say to the audience in one of these nightclubs, toward the end of the show, I would say, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and if you had, I'm here all week, please come back and bring your friends, because I always change the show around and you'll see something different, something new. And they would. Not everyone, but enough that the cumulative numbers were really great. And I was getting kind of top-of-the-line money and return engagements, and it was a very successful thing for me. And it was my primary work for 13 years. At the end of it, which is about 1991, I was starting to get tired of it. It was a grind, a lot of traveling. The conditions of these clubs were not always elegant, and I was getting tired of it. So I decided to phase out of doing it. It was right around that time that the comedy boom really ended. And these clubs, some of them started closing, and the ones that remained started paying less money. It looked like I was really smart seeing what the future was and leaving, but that's not true. It was just lucky that I decided to stop around the same time that it made sense to stop.
Well, clearly, the Max Maven we know today was been shaped by experience and by putting himself on the line and wanting to learn. On the next conversation, I would like to know about your influences, but that's on the next one.
All right.